This is the lecture on workers. We've already studied the expansion, dramatic expansion of industry. Well, it had its downsides. 15% of the workers were unemployed during Depression years. 1/4 of the population was unemployed 3 months out of every year. It's not like you could plan on buying anything, that is a home and so on. This was a matter of saving for the disaster that was to come. We have a little video on child labor that we will show later on. But what's important here is a dramatic change in the view on poverty. Remember, social Darwinism, the rich were rich because they were adaptable, because they were better people, smarter. Poor were poor because they spent all their money on bad things, and so on. Well, it was evident this could not be sustained. This view of poverty could not be sustained. And there were many ideas on how to improve it. There was, to be sure, little assistance to the poor from local governments, some from political bosses, it's in your book, some from churches and charitable institutions. But there is a change of view. Some ministers began preaching the social gospel. The gospel is not only about personal responsibility, but also about social responsibility. And they pointed to Matthew 25, the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25, where Jesus separates the good and the bad guys, and the good guys are those who fed the hungry, who clothed the naked, who accompanied those who were suffering, because they saw Christ there. Whenever you see one of these, you see me. It's a critical chapter in the Gospels. The Catholic Church had come up with doctrines of social justice, and in particular the whole idea of a family wage. So there was a movement to change things. There was the beginnings of the view of the wasteful use of the natural resources, the end of forests, the pollution of rivers, the continued mining of coal, and so on. And, the fact that these corporate power were reaping the money from other people, from small merchants, from workers. You see this cartoon where you have this big wealthy man and politicians and others coming and adoring them by bringing them money. The issue of poverty became acute, became dramatic, because the growing cities made those problems more visible. There was poverty on the countryside, but it wasn't as evident as it was in the city. And this was, there were other changes as well. We've already talked about the beginnings of the middle class. And so it was quite evident that America was changing. You have the very wealthy, a growing middle class, and a huge number of poor. This was most evident during the terrible Depression of 1893. It was very clear that this land of equal opportunity was not for everybody. And so there arose a number of reformers that we're going to consider. Just like in the farm movement, there were reformers. In this case, labor unions. And they get some limited reforms. Then there's the more radical, seemingly radical views of socialists and anarchists. Anarchists are those who want to destroy government, create chaos in society, will play a little song in class later on about this. One of the unions was the Knights of Labor. And it was a fraternity, and this fraternity reached out to everybody, wanted to organize the skilled and the unskilled, every kind of occupation. It had a wider world view. It began as a brotherhood, just like the Grange and the Farmers Alliance. The Knights of Labor also began as a brotherhood with rituals, symbols, and so on. And they conducted huge parades to show their strength and their support across all classes in society, across various occupations. Well, there was, issue of some problems with this, as well as benefits, of course. The Knights of Labor sought to organize everybody, as we've said, various industries, skilled and unskilled, advocated all kinds of worker, family, and social issues, proposed wide-scale solutions, boycotts, general strikes, and unfortunately, it was generally unsuccessful. There was some violence by workers, but mostly against workers. And business, of course, feared the disorder or anarchy that this widespread, boycotts and general strikes would cause. And, of course, there was an interesting riot in the Haymarket Square in Chicago, where some policemen were killed. And as we will see, we'll play a little video to show that they were condemning people by association without any real evidence. And then there was this massive Pullman strike of 1894, 50,000 workers taking over railroad yards, and so on. Very, very frightening to society. The other group, the American Federation of Labor, organized skilled workers, specific shop strikes, specific industries. Didn't go for the massive boycotts, massive strikes that the Knights of Labor did. They were a little bit more successful because of that. They weren't viewed upon as friendly to all workers because they weren't. They sought to have gains only with those groups that seemed practical, where striking seemed doable. And even then, there was all kinds of, violence against them. They had a strong organization financially. They struck for specific issues, wages, hours, conditions, and so on. And they looked for support from politicians for labor. They were by far more successful than the Knights of Labor, but still there was violence against them. The middle class was simply scared. The number of strikes, the disorder, the property damage, and although they were successful, they weren't as successful as they could have been. There were strong anti-union, actions by businesses, hiring scabs, that is, someone willing to break a strike. There were armed guards hired by companies, and then they blamed the violence on the unions. But they won some concessions. And state and federal workers, federal and state government used forces, troops, against the strikers. Some reforms were secured to regulate business, worker protections, and they got the political parties to support them, and third parties, of course. Many of them were ruled unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court, unfortunately. This was not a pro-worker friendly time. So this gave rise to the extremes, the Socialist Party that wanted government to own everything, to control everything. And this certainly, and they received wide support, but they were seen as un-American. Workers did join forces with populists at one point, but they weren't completely in favor of the issue of silver, and it didn't help the workers' cause. All right, we'll continue with this in class.